This is the Pomoly Oroqen Mini tent stove. It is the smaller version of a larger stove, also called the Oroqen, and out of all of my camping videos, I get more questions and comments about this than anything else. So I thought it would be a good time to speak a little deeper about this stove, its pros and cons, who it's for, and although this exact stove is no longer available, there is an alternative stove that is a little bit better, in my opinion, but a little bit more, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, specs-wise, it is about 16 inches or 41 centimeters in length by 10.5 inches or 27 centimeters wide, which is the footprint of the stove based on its feet. And it stands about 11 inches, which is about 28 centimeters tall, but with the flue in place, it can reach up to 6 feet. Now, when the wings are folded out, its width is 18 inches or 46 centimeters. Without the wings on the top, it's about 18 centimeters. So the wings do add a great amount of more space. Now, it weighs about 14.8 pounds, which is 6.7 kilograms. More on that in a minute, and it is made from 304 stainless steel with high temperature refractory glass. Now, the internal firebox volume is 11.5 liters, so it's not huge, hence it being the Mini, I guess, but a nice size for a stove of this size, and it gives out an incredible amount of heat. Now, I bought this stove about 3 years ago for just under £200, which is about $249, and I have used it in snow, heavy rain, strong winds, and with a lot of different hot tents as well. And it is probably one of the best pieces of kit that I own, one that I appreciate the most as well. Now, when I was looking for a tent stove, I had a huge checklist of what I wanted, and when I found this one, it pretty much ticked every box. Now, the checklist was, firstly, I didn't want to spend a fortune on a stove, as some of these stoves can be ridiculously expensive, especially when you're looking at some of the high-end Pomoly ones with the big ovens. You were talking nearly £1,000. As mentioned, this particular Oroqen stove from Pomoly was just a smidge under 200, as I say, which is still a decent amount of money, but for what it offers, especially in comparison to everything else that I was looking at, it was really good value. Now, I also wanted to have a stove that had a solid flue, as in most cases when I go camping, it is really windy, and I feel like one of those sort of roll-out flues that you see, the sort of sheet metal ones that you find on the lightweight flat-pack stoves, would just not survive those winds. The Oroqen Mini has this really solid flue that can just sort of slot into each other, and it also packs away really nicely inside. It can be extended as well, I believe. If you have a taller tent, you can get extended segments or extra segments. Now, I also wanted a stove with wings or pot stands on either side, as I knew that would be really helpful when it comes to cooking proper meals. If you've seen any of my camping cook videos, it is really helpful for finding a good simmer spot, or just keeping things warm, or just extra real estate for putting stuff on. It is quite a game changer having those extra wings, and these ones are really solid as well. Now, I also didn't want the stove to be heavy, as although I mostly car camp, sometimes I do have a small hike to get to where I'm going, especially when I'm wild camping, only around sort of 2 miles at most, so a super lightweight stove wasn't really necessary, but I also didn't want to be carrying some huge heavy stove around, as they can just get really heavy sometimes. And as stated, this stove is about 6.5 kilograms, about 14.8 pounds. And if you compare that to the non-mini version, the normal Oroqen, that is over 10 kilograms or 22.5 pounds. So quite the difference. However, if you have a long hike ahead of you, say 5 miles plus, this Oroqen Mini is probably not a good option either. Now, that was just my kind of initial checklist of what I was looking for before I even started using the stove. Since I've had it and used it a lot, I have begun to appreciate a lot more of what this stove has to offer. Now, setting up the stove is really easy, as it comes in this pretty cool carry case that just sort of clips around it with straps to tie it down. It also has 2 really wide, big handles to carry it, so really comfortable. It doesn't pull on your fingers, it doesn't feel too tight. The pot stands on either side just simply fold down when it's all wrapped up, but they also act as handles, allowing you to easily pick it up and then fold out the feet. And since using this, I have really come to appreciate these feet, which wasn't something I even thought about, but looking at a lot of these other stoves that have these really flimsy-looking lightweight feet, they look like they could just easily tip over, which I've never had a problem with this stove in that regard. They are very robust, they hold in place perfectly, and you can feel the strength of them as you actually fold it out. Now, you can just remove the pot stands if you don't want to use them, if you need more space, for example. They do detach, but I personally love having them on for many reasons, but also it just looks kind of nice. The wings also have these little slotted holes where you can put utensils, keeping things off the ground, provided they're alright to get quite warm. It's also quite useful for drying things out like gloves or hats, because you can't really lay them over the stove themselves, they will just melt. So it keeps it out of the way, but allows it to kind of air out and steam dry. Now, when it comes to cooking, this is an excellent tool to help with making proper meals, cooking proper recipes. If you have seen any of my camp cooking videos, you'll see just how versatile the stove is. I have cooked numerous meals on this stove, you know, proper pastas and curries, and it has never failed me. As I say, you have the space to put a lot of pots. You can regulate the cooking temperature a little bit better than you would if it was just slapped bang on the middle. I would also like to try sticking food inside the firebox, maybe to try baking something or roasting it like a potato wrapped in foil. That should be possible, but I've not tried it yet. Now, some other features around this stove are the flue comes with this triangular guy attachment point, so if the winds are really strong, you can guy it out to keep it more stable. I mean, I've had this in gusts of 50 miles an hour, and it was absolutely fine without even guying it out, although it did get sketchy a couple of times. At the bottom of the flue, there is a damper valve to allow you to adjust the amount of air draw, along with a bottom air intake as well, which can be either slid open or closed, but also doubles up as the ash catcher, so you can easily clean it up. But if you wanted a little bit more air getting in, you can slightly pull it out, and that will just allow the air to draw through. Personally, I've never needed to do that myself, but I always do leave the valve open at the bottom anyway, especially when you're lighting the fire. Just gives it the oxygen it needs before you can somewhat slightly close it off, depending on what type of heat you're after. Now, you do get this handy metal hook thing, which you can use to open or shut the door. You can adjust the air intake, or just poke the fire if you need to get it settled for like coals and whatnot. I do suggest using it, as this stove can kick out a hell of a lot of heat. Also, make sure that you have a good pair of thick gloves for handling things, especially if you're packing it away after just using it. You might want to lift it out of your tent, so make sure you've got that. Now, there aren't many downsides to this stove, not in terms of its intended use cases. I think the main issue most people would have would really depend on what tent you're using and the size of the stove. Small tents, up to sort of 3-person tents, it works great and gets very cozy inside. I've used this with the Stove Hut, the Chalet 70, the Hussar 2.0, and most recently the Open Vista, and it heated those tents without a problem at all. But in my other hot tent, which is the Circle 6, so a large 3-person sort of dome teepee tent, it looks more like a circus tent, it really just warmed a small area and the part above it, rather than spreading around the tent properly. Now, this is of course very dependent on the temperature that you're camping in, and for that camp it did get pretty cold, dropping close to around 0, maybe going under in fact. If you have a stove fan, that can help, but it's not necessarily something you're going to pack every time, so do keep that in mind. Small tents or medium tents with low ceilings, this mini stove is perfect for, and it warms it up really nicely. In larger tents with a higher ceiling, not so much, nor will the flue go out of the top far enough to, stop the sparks from dropping on your tent. Although it does come with a spark arrestor, which is very good. Now, another downside is, again, due to how small the stove is, you do need to chop wood, maybe a little more so than you would have for a normal stove or a full-size stove, which can mean more work, either when camping or getting prepared. A good best practice is always to just measure your log against the sort of stove to ensure that the wood you're packing will fit, otherwise you are going to have to process at camp. Now, one thing to point out is how after quite a lot of use, as I say, I've used this for 3 years, the stove has started to kind of warp the top slightly. Not massively, it's just no longer perfectly flat. Everything still sits on fine. It's not dangerous, but it will impact your cooking ability or your heating ability. Again, it's only a real minor thing. It's not moved a lot, but I do have to move things around a little bit more now to just find the best source of heat, which could really just be because of where the fire is inside the firebox. Now, I guess the big question is, who is this stove for? If you're like me and you use smallish hot tents on average, like the Open Vista, Stove Hut, Chalet 70, those sorts of things, it will heat the whole tent without a problem, and it will get into the 20s maybe 30s if you really crank it up. It can get very hot. It is not for backpackers. This is for small to medium sort of base camps where you set up your tent and you leave it. So car camping, boat camping, that kind of thing. For me, I mostly use it for my solo overnighters, wild camping or long weekends, either wild camping or at a campsite, provided they don't mind stoves. But personally, I don't just use it for winter. In the summertime, it can get pretty cold on an evening. And I have camped in a hot tent in summertime and found myself retreating into the tent at night, zipping it down and just cranking the stove up and just relaxing and really enjoying that warmth. So you can use it all year round, but I don't tend to use it overnight, as mostly I can't be bothered keeping it going overnight due to how small the pieces of wood are. It's not something that you can just throw in the wood and forget about, as it'll burn through a lot quicker than a normal stove would. But I suppose you don't even need to have a tent to use this. You can literally stick it outside of your tent, for example, or outside your hammock, and just have it as a fire pit. It would work really well for that, and you can cook on it. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this particular stove is no longer available, but there is another almost identical stove called the Pomoly Oroqen Mini 3, and that has 2 glass sides instead of 2 solid walls. That costs about $50 more, so about £35. Had that existed when I was looking for stoves and saw both the Oroqen Mini and the Oroqen Mini 3, I would have gone for the 3, just because that glass would offer better lighting, it would be nice to watch, and maybe even slightly more heat as well. Now, I will link both of the stoves below so that you can kind of see the difference between them. I'm not affiliated, I don't earn anything from this. They are just really great stoves, and I cannot recommend them enough. I will obviously keep using this for my smaller tents, but in future I will most definitely be picking up one of the larger sort of oven stoves to heat my larger tent and any of the bigger tents I have, as that would just offer much better cooking options, like baking and roasting properly. For now though, this is absolutely amazing. Highly recommend it. Do check it out. But with that, that is the end of this review of the Pomoly Oroqen Mini. If you found this video useful, please do consider subscribing and hitting that thumbs up. It is much appreciated. And if you'd like to be notified whenever I put up a video, hit that little notification bell. Thank you so much for watching. Do check out my other videos, and I'll see you in the next one.